Let's talk about women in the 1940s. So we're going to skip the 30s. A lot of great stuff happened in the 30s with women's history in regards to like labor activism and stuff like that. But we're going to have to just kind of pass that and go into the 1940s and then talk about the 1950s, because those are two kind of opposite directions that women take in that particular 20 years. So we're going to look at their role in the 1940s during World War II, and then see how their life changes in the 1950s. It's almost like a 180, where there is a sense of optimism, partly because many of them were working during World War II, but also it's a state of anxiety because by the 1950s they're told to go home, and life gets pretty boring being home. In case you haven't noticed that already, with this whole situation happening, it's kind of boring just sitting at home and watching TV all day, right? So we're going to look at those type of issues. Let's skip that. So we begin by looking at white women in the workforce during the 1940s. We find that many women begin to enter the workforce out of necessity, right? Women are needed to help during the war effort. Men, not all men, but a good number of men are sent into the front lines to Europe and the Pacific to go fight during World War II. So women play their part and enter the workforce in large numbers. And these are just some numbers that you see here. 5 million women entering the workforce, and that gives them a sense of independence by entering the workforce. And not only do they start to work, but they enter jobs that are typically not associated with women, right? They're these kind of gender jobs. And this gives them the ability to show that they can do it, that they can do jobs that are typically associated with men, such as welding or riveting or being electricianists. So women, not only do they get the opportunity to do these jobs, but they also learn new skills. And the workforce, particularly if the company has a contract by the federal government, they are required to pay an equal salary to what a man makes. So this is something that we hear today, right, with sports teams, particularly national teams and things like that. But it is something that was implemented in the 1940s because these women were doing jobs that men were doing. A lot of times where we have this kind of division in pay is because the assumption is that a woman will be married and be provided by a man. And that's just not the reality in which real people live, right? A lot of women are independent or are single-headed households. So equal pay is something very important. And in this example, the federal government supported that idea. And we find that many white women were able to join unions during this period. The unions, though might sound like something bad today, a lot of people hate unions for some weird reason. Unions actually create the middle class in America. So we find that there's union membership increase in women during this wartime period because they see it as their ability to get better pay and really safer working conditions. So joining the union definitely benefited not only them, but it kind of benefited the entire company because not only it got them better pay and better working conditions. When it came to women of color, as you can probably assume, things were not that great. A lot of time for African American women, they were the last hired, first fired in many of these jobs. But there you see African American women working on airplanes. One thing that was kind of positive was that it allowed African American women to leave domestic work in regards to being maids and those type of tasks. The war opened up opportunities that they would have never had it not been for the war. So they began to enter these kind of industrial jobs and no longer have to be somebody's nannies or take care of somebody's household. So there is this element of positivity by them entering the workforce, or this particular workforce. And the interesting thing, whereas with Anglo-American women, they were at home and the war allowed them to enter the workforce, for women of color, they've always had to work. They just worked in different industries. So the same kind of goes with other women of different descents that's now Anglo-American. So just to give you a few more numbers, here we see African American women, their numbers increase in the industrial sector. We find, one last point, sorry, that even though women are entering these positions, many of them are being segregated within these fields. So it's not until the 1960s where these issues come to the forefront, but during the 1940s, segregation is definitely very common in many work environments. For Mexican American, nobody really cared whether you were here legal or illegal, right? There's a need for labor. They needed women to work in the in different fields, particularly for Mexican American. It was in the agricultural field. A lot of them did canning, vegetables and fruits and things like that. So they were able to enter these type of fields. And then you did get a reading that I posted in the previous lesson of Mexican American women working at, I think it was Lockheed Martin. And if you got a chance to look at that particular reading, it's one that wasn't required, but I attached it to the PDF, where Mexican American women, one woman in particular, was kind of worked her way up Lockheed Martin, which is today it's a very important kind of industry, and they do planes and military technology and things like that. Well, she was able to get her foot in the door and then start at the bottom and actually began to kind of teach other people. So hopefully, maybe at the very least glance at that piece. But that is a Mexican American woman who enters the workforce. I do have one example where one woman, a Mexican American woman, she wanted a pair of shoes, and it was during this period, and she told me, no, she didn't tell me, sorry, she wrote that she wanted to make enough money to buy her shoes. And eventually it just, she really enjoyed it. She really enjoyed the idea that she was making money and being somewhat independent, right? Not being dependent on her husband all the time, asking him for money. So for many women, just entering the workforce gave them that form of agency. And then lastly, for women of Japanese descent, unfortunately, their experience is much different because it is during the war. And we find that many of them were put in internment camps just for the very fact that they were Asian American. In order for them to leave these camps, and this is what made it so complicated, is that many of them were Nisei, many of them were first generation born in the United States. Many of them were born in the US, and all they knew was the United States. However, in order to be let out of these camps, sometimes they had to basically no longer be U.S. citizens, kind of declare that they would no longer be U.S. citizen and be deported to Japan. And the interesting thing here is that many of them didn't know Japan because, that was a whole ocean apart, right? And all they knew was the United States because they were born and raised here. So for Asian American women, this was a very kind of trying time for them. Because they were not seen as U.S. citizens in the context of the war. Now, the 1950s was a completely different era for women. Here we're talking mostly about Anglo-American women. We find that it was a baby boom as men begin to return from the war. Families begin to increase. So in the 1930s, your average family in regards to children was about 2.4. But in the 1950s, it increases to 3.2. So they're having larger families. In addition, this is a period that's called the Pax Americana. The war is no longer there. The Depression is over. Many of these people grew up during the Depression. They begin to have families. So they want to give their kids some of the things that they never had. We do see, even though poverty is quite high, Americans begin to see themselves as middle class. We begin to see an emphasis of the nuclear family. American families begin to move to the suburbs. This is the age where the suburbs begin to explode. We find that most of them begin to mortgage homes, for large period of times because nobody has the money just to buy a house outright. And they really kind of follow this notion of the ideal relationship amongst, different couples where the husband goes to work and the wife stays at home. Now understand that the 1950s is influenced by the Red Scare. Anybody that challenges those kind of ideals of that nuclear family with the mom, dad, and the kids, and kind of goes rogue, they are seen as a threat. So in the context of the 1950s, you do have this kind of anti-communist sentiment, even though it's not, many people were communists in the 1900s, right? The IWW, particularly in the 1930s and the Great Depression. Communism seemed like an alternative political philosophy. Now in the 1950s, that essentially became a crime, where people were forced to sign loyalty oaths. If you worked at a factory, you had to sign that, your loyalty was to the United States. And anybody that went outside that concept of quote unquote normal was viewed as a threat. So Executive Order 10450 kind of attacked anybody who was probably, who might have been viewed as gay, or, again, didn't follow that ideal American family. So this kind of shapes the politics for the 1950s. And what I want you to do is actually read the article, and obviously you have a quiz, by Betty Friedan, that talks about this nuclear family, right? That talks about people living in suburbia, and you're supposed to be happy with your husband working and you being a housewife, and he's providing all this material stuff for you. Yet the question that comes up is, are these people happy, right? They have everything. We're talking about white people here because minorities were not allowed to live in some of these suburbs. And I'm not trying to be funny. That's just the reality of it. A lot of segregation at this period. So even though these women have all this material gain and all this stuff, basically, many of them are very unhappy. And Betty Friedan, the article that you have, The Problem That Has No Name, talks about that issue, right? That these women are depressed. When anybody else looking in might go, wow, why are you depressed? You got everything you could ever hope for. So she does a nice job kind of addressing that. And what I would want you to do is kind of connect it to the movie if you're going